I can't say exactly when I realized it. There wasn't a specific day, no significant event, no difficult conversation or dramatic farewell. It was more like slowly waking up from a long dream and realizing, only after fully awake, that something had changed while I was sleeping. The house was silent that morning, as it always was, in fact. But, for the first time, the silence seemed different to me. It wasn't just an absence of sound. It was an absence of the possibility of sound. I was sitting in the kitchen, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone cold in my hands. I don't remember if I had drunk it or if I had simply forgotten it there, holding it as if the gesture itself were enough. The morning light streamed through the window, illuminating the dust floating in the air. I watched those briques points dancing slowly without Destin. And then I thought, when was the last time someone called? Not to warn me about something, not to resolve anything practical, just to talk, to hear my voice, to ask how I was, truly expecting a real answer. I tried to remember. I went back days, weeks, and the further back I went, the more I realized I couldn't find that connection. There were messages, of course, quick texts. Are you okay, Mom? Do you need anything? I'll stop by this weekend. But the voice, the timing, the complete presence of someone on the other end of the line, without rushing, without already thinking about the next task, that had disappeared. Before we begin, if this type of story resonates with you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you'll always be notified whenever a new narrative like this is shared here. These are simple, human stories, meant to be listened to calmly perhaps when you need them most. I grew up in a house full of voices. My mother sang while she cooked. My father had that loud laugh that echoed through the rooms and made you smile even without knowing what he was laughing about. My siblings fought, yelled, and made noise all the time. I found it exhausting. I dreamed of silence, of peace, and then came my own family, my husband, the children, and again the house was full. Full of was hurried foot slamming doors, simultaneous conversations at time, full of people asking for things, needing things, wanting attention. I remember feeling exhausted. Sometimes I just wanted 5 minutes alone, 5 minutes of complete silence. It's funny how we don't realize the value of noise until it's gone. The children grew up. That's natural. I knew. They left home. They went to study, to work, to build their own lives. I was proud of that. I still am. I did my job well. They are doing well. They are happy. My husband died 7 years ago. Stroke. It happened quickly. He was fine in the morning, and by the afternoon he was gone. I cried. Of course I cried. But not in the way I imagined I would. It was a strange, silent pain that settled in my chest and never completely left. Like a constant weight. Like something you carry and forget you're carrying until you make some movement and feel it again. After I left, became king the children. He still had the visitors. He still had the connections. At least I thought I did. In the first few months, they came a lot, concerned, attentive. They asked if I was okay, if I needed company, if I wanted to go out to dinner. I said I was fine, and I was, in a way. I had spent my whole life taking care of people. I knew how to take care of myself. Gradually, the visits became less frequent. Naturally, I thought, their lives they have work. They have young children. They have commitments. I understood. I truly understood. But understanding doesn't make the absence any less painful. I started noticing small signs, small details that, on their own meant nothing. But, together, they formed a pattern that I could no longer ignore. The calls became shorter, more functional. "Hi, Mom. Just checking in to see if everything's okay. Do you need anything?" And before I could really answer, before I could tell her about my day, about what I'd been thinking, about that memory that had surfaced, the words would come. "That's good. Okay then. Let me know if you need anything. Bye. I have to go." Invitations started coming less frequently. Birthdays, still. Christmas, still. But Sunday lunches, casual outings, visits without a specific reason, these have been disappearing. And the strangest thing is, nobody said anything. There wasn't a conversation. There wasn't a moment when someone sat me down and said, "Mom, we're going to start seeing you less." It just happened, as if it were inevitable, as if it were a natural part of the aging process. Maybe so, but nobody warned me it would be like this. I started looking at other people my age. Women I knew from church, the market, the little square where I sometimes sat to sunbathe. And I realized we all had the same expression. That slightly lost look. That polite but distant smile. As if we were all trapped in an invisible place where people look through us, but not exactly at us. Once, I was at the supermarket. I was taking my time, choosing a product from the shelf. Nothing unusual. Just reading the labels, comparing prices, trying to decide. A young man, in a hurry, stopped beside me. He stood there, clearly waiting for me to move. He didn't say anything. He wasn't rude. Ajoute, with the posture of someone who already has their mind on the next task. I moved. I grabbed the first product I saw and kept going. But as I pushed the stroller down the hallway, I felt something strange. A feeling of being in the way, of taking up too much space, of being too slow for the pace of the world around me. I went home that day and sat in the same kitchen chair, same cup of coffee, same window, same light revealing the dust in the air. And I wondered, when did I become invisible? Because that's what I was feeling, invisibility, not overnight, but gradual, silent, as if, with each passing year, I lost a little more sharpness, a little more presence, until, without realizing it, I had become part of the scenery. Some nobody really read la fanzo première luke datit. The screen was black, blank. Still, I thought about calling someone. My daughter, maybe, or my son, just to talk. No specific reason, just to hear their voices, to feel that a real connection still existed. But then came that thought, that small but suffocating thought. What if they're busy? What if I'm interrupting? What if the call is inconvenient? And I realized I was afraid. Fear of being a burden. Fear of being an obligation. Fear of hearing that polite hurry in their voices. That tone of someone trying to appear present when, in reality, they're already somewhere else. So I didn't call. I put the phone back on the table and continued looking out the window. And I realized that perhaps this was the hardest part of growing old. Not the aching body, not the failing memory, not the wrinkles or the gray hair, but this slow fading, this feeling that you're still here, still have so much to say, so much to offer, but the world has already moved on, and you've been left behind, not because you did anything wrong, just because you've grown old, because somehow at the moment when you most need company, presence, voices around you is precisely when they begin to drift away, and nobody warns you about it. No one sits with you when you're young and says, one day you'll miss even the noise that used to tire you so much. One day the silence will be so heavy that you'll want to scream, just to make sure your voice still works. I finished drinking the cold coffee. I washed the cup. Première redite. I put it back in the cupboard. And as I closed the closet door, I wondered, how much longer until I disappear completely? The days began to resemble one another, not in a bad way, necessarily, just the same, as if each morning were a copy of the previous one, with minor variations that didn't really change anything. I would wake up, make coffee, sit in the same chair, look out the same window, wait. Wait for what? Exactly. I didn't know anymore. Sometimes I would turn on the television, not because I wanted to watch anything specific, but simply to fill the silence with voices that weren't mine. Voices of people talking about things that didn't concern me. News, cooking shows, soap operas. It didn't matter. The important thing was not to be completely alone with my own thoughts. Because thoughts, when you have too much time to dwell on them, can be cruel. I started noticing things that had previously gone unnoticed. The way the silence of the house had different textures depending on the time of day. In the morning, it was a silence full of possibilities, as if the day could still bring something. In the afternoon, it was a heavier silence, almost bored. And at night was when the silence became almost unbearable. Because it was at that moment that I realized the day was over and nothing had happened. Nothing at all. Nobody had called. Nobody had visited. No surprises. Nothing new. Just another day, identical to the previous one. I was trying to fill the time with small tasks. I cleaned the house, even though it was already clean. He reorganized closets that didn't need reorganizing. He cooked simple meals just for me and ate in silence, sitting at the table that had already accommodated so many people, so many conversations, so much laughter. Now, the table seemed too big, as if it were constantly reminding me of everything that used to be there and wasn't anymore. One afternoon, I was dusting the living room bookshelf when I found an old photo. It was from a birthday party. I don't remember exactly which one. My children were still small. My husband was beside me, with that wide smile he always had. We were all looking at the camera, all of us together. I held the photo for a long time. I tried to remember that day, what we had talked about, what we had laughed about, but the memories were blurry, as if they had happened to someone else in another life. I put the photo back in its place, but something lingered, a strange feeling in my chest, not exactly sadness. It was more like longing for myself, longing for the woman I was in that photo, the one who was needed, the one who had a clear role, mother, wife, center of something. Now I was just me, and sometimes even that seemed uncertain. I started noticing how people treated me when I left the house. Not intentionally, I think, but there was a difference, a polite distance, as if I were too fragile or too irrelevant to deserve genuine attention. At the bank, the teller spoke to me slowly, almost shouting as if I were deaf. I'm not, but she assumed so. And when I tried to explain something, she would interrupt, smiling with that forced patience, and solve everything for me, as if I weren't capable of understanding my own account. As a Bekri, the bill looked at me. He mechanically scanned my purchases, held out his hand to receive the money, gave me the change, all without making eye contact, as if I were just another transaction, just another task to be completed before the next one. And I understood. He was young. His mind was elsewhere. I didn't take it personally. But even so, it hurts. It hurts to realize that you've become so ordinary, so expected, so much a part of the scenery, that nobody really sees you anymore. Once, I tripped on the sidewalk. I didn't actually fall, but I lost my balance for a second. A woman walked past me, glanced quickly, but didn't stop. She didn't ask if I was okay. She just kept going, hurriedly, her mind already elsewhere. I stood there, clutching my bag tighter than I needed to. And I thought, if I had actually fallen, would anyone have stopped me? Or would I have just stayed there on the ground, waiting until someone eventually noticed? I went home that day feeling smaller, as if I were shrinking, not physically, but in some other way, as if my presence in the world was becoming weaker and weaker. That night, I tried to call my daughter. I rang 3 times before it went to voicemail. Hi, leave your message. Her voice recorded, mechanical, impersonal. I hung up without leaving a message. What would I say? Anyway, hi, daughter. I just wanted to hear your voice. I just wanted to know that you still remember me. No, that would be ridiculous. Dramatic. She has her own life, her own problems, her own commitments. I can't just call her all the time expecting her to be available just because I feel lonely. But at the same time, a part of me screamed, and why not? I'm your mother. I've spent years available to you, anytime, for anything. Why now, when it's me who needs help, does it seem like I'm asking too much? I didn't say it out loud, of course, not even to myself, most of the time. But the thought was there, hovering, persistent. I began to realize that the worst thing about getting older wasn't the loneliness itself. It was the fear of admitting I was alone, because admitting it meant accepting it. And accepting it meant giving up hope that things could ever go back to the way they were. And I didn't want to give up on that hope. Not yet. So I continued, pretending everything was fine. I continued answering I'm great when someone asked. I continued smiling politely. I continued filling my time with small, unimportant tasks just so I wouldn't have to face the emptiness. But at night, when I lay in bed, the emptiness would still catch up with me. I would stare at the ceiling, listening to the silence of the house, and I would wonder, how much longer? How much longer until I get used to this? Until the silence stops hurting? Or does it never stop? Is it like this until the end? Do you just learn to live with the pain, but it never truly goes away? I had no answer, and perhaps that was the scariest part, not knowing, not being sure of anything. Just feeling that something essential had changed and that I had absolutely no control over it. It was on one of those nights that I started thinking about something that scared me. I thought, what if I died tomorrow? How long would it take for someone to notice? It wasn't a suicidal thought. I didn't want to die. But the question was there, persistent, realistic. My children would call maybe once a week. Sometimes 10 days would go by without news. If I died on a Monday, they might not find out until the weekend or the following week. And then I imagined my body here in the house alone for days, and I imagined them receiving the news. And I imagined the guilt they would feel. Why didn't I call sooner? Why didn't I go visit? And then I thought, is that it? Is the only way for me to become important again, to be seen again, after I'm no longer here? I quickly pushed the thought away. It was too morbid, too sad, and I didn't want to sink any deeper into it. But the thought had left a mark, an unsettling awareness that, perhaps, my presence in the world was no longer as essential as I would like to believe. I got out of bed, even though it was late. I went to the kitchen. I made tea. I sat at the table. The house was dark, except for the dim light above the stove. I held the warm cup in my hands and stared into nothingness, and I wondered, how did I get here? Not physically, but emotionally. How did I go from a life full of people, noise, and importance to this suffocating quiet? How did I become this woman sitting alone in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, holding a cup of tea and wondering if anyone would miss her? There wasn't one event. There wasn't one turning point. It was gradual, imperceptible, like aging. You don't notice it while it's happening. You only notice it after it's already happened. And now it was done. I was old. I was alone. I was invisible. And there was nothing I could do to change that. Or was there? I don't know if it was a conscious decision or if it just happened. But at some point, after that night, in the kitchen, something inside me changed. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden revelation. It was more like getting tired of waiting. Tired of waiting for the phone to ring. Tired of waiting for someone to show up. Tired of waiting for my life to regain the weight it once had. And when you stop waiting, a strange space opens up. An empty space, but also curiously light, as if you had dropped something heavy that you had been carrying for too long. I started going out more. Not to specific places, just going out. Walking the streets of the neighborhood, sitting in the little square, watching people go by, children playing, couples talking, dogs chasing bulls. I wasn't part of it, but I also didn't feel so separate anymore. It was like watching life unfold and, somehow, being at peace with the fact that it continued, with or without me, at the center. One morning, I was sitting on a park bench when a woman sat down next to me. She must have been about my age, maybe a little younger. She had that tired look of someone who also carries invisible burden. We stood there, side by side, in silence, for a few minutes. Then she sighed and said, almost as if she were talking to herself, "Funny how we spend our whole lives running around and suddenly we have nowhere left to go." I looked at her. She wasn't looking at me. She was just looking ahead, at the movement in the square. "That's true," I said softly. She smiled. Not a happy smile, but a smile of recognition, of someone who understands. "My children have grown up," she continued. "My husband passed away. And now I wake up every day and think, what now? What do I do with all this time?" I didn't answer immediately. I just stood there, feeling the weight of her words. Because they were my words too. They were the words of so many women our age, sitting on park benches, pretending they were just enjoying the sun. "I don't know either," I finally said. "I guess I'm trying to figure it out." She nodded. We stayed there for a few more minutes, sharing that silence which, for the first time in a long time, didn't feel lonely. It was a shared silence, a silence that said, "I know, I understand, you're not alone in this." Then she stood up, adjusted her bag on her shoulder, and said, "If you find out, let me know." And she smiled again, that tired but genuine smile. "My name is Helena, by the way. I live over there, on the street behind." "Marta," I said. "Nice to meet you. The pleasure is mine." "En délef." I stood there, thinking about that brief encounter, about those simple words. And I realized I wasn't alone in what I felt. That perhaps there were dozens, hundreds, thousands of women like me, scattered around the world, all feeling this same invisibility, this same emptiness. This didn't make the emptiness any less, but somehow it made it more bearable, knowing that it wasn't just me, that it wasn't my fault, that it was just life, time, the natural course of things. I started noticing other women like me on the streets, in the markets, on the buses, all with that slightly lost look, that polite but distant smile, all carrying their own versions of my silence. And I started to wonder, what would be different if, instead of waiting for someone to see me, I started seeing others? Instead of waiting for someone to call, I called. Instead of waiting for company, I offered company. Not that this would solve everything. I knew it wouldn't. But maybe it would make a difference. Maybe it would make the days a little less burdensome. The first time I tried it was difficult. I picked up the phone to call my daughter and stared at the screen for almost 10 minutes before dialing. My heart was racing, my hands were sweating, and that voice inside my head wouldn't stop. What if she's busy? What if you're bothering her? What if she thinks you're being pushy, needy, demanding? But I dialed anyway. It rang. It rang. It rang. Hi, Mom. Her voice sounded somewhat surprised, not necessarily in a bad way, just surprised. Hi, daughter, how are you? Everything's fine. And you? I'm fine. I just wanted to hear your voice. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, and in that silence, I felt my stomach clench. She's going to say she's busy. She's going to cut the conversation short. She's going to. That's great, Mom. It's been a long time since we've had a proper conversation, and then we talked. It wasn't long, maybe 10, 15 minutes. But it was real. She told me about her work, about the boys, about a silly argument she'd had with her husband over a broken tap. Small things, everyday things, nothing extraordinary. But, for me, at that moment, it was everything. When Premier UP, highlights, feeling strange warmth, spread. It wasn't complete happiness, but it was something. It was connection. It was presence. It was remembering that I still existed for someone. And I realized something. She hadn't called me. It's true. But when I called, she answered. She talked. She was there. Maybe the problem wasn't that nobody cared. Maybe the problem was that everyone was so busy, so immersed in their own lives, that they simply didn't think to call. Not out of malice, not out of neglect, just out of forgetfulness, out of haste, out of assuming I was fine because I always said I was. What if I stopped expecting them to read my mind? What if I stopped expecting them to realize, on their own, that I needed company? What if I just asked? It was strange. To spend 7 lot burden for much, no toba to einer and all of that. But I started trying. When my son called the following week, instead of automatically saying I'm fine, I said, I've been feeling a little lonely lately. Could you come over for coffee sometime? He was silent for a second. Then he said, Sure, Mom. How about Saturday? En décam? He arrived Saturday morning with a cake his wife had made. We sat at the table, talked, laughed at silly things. And when he left, the house was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet, lighter, because now it smelled of freshly brewed coffee. It had the echo of laughter. It had the recent memory of not being alone. I started small with other things too. I started greeting people on the street, not in an exaggerated way, just a wave, a smile, a genuine good morning. Most people responded automatically without really looking. But some did look, and in that second of eye contact, there was something. A minimal connection. A recognition that I existed and they existed, and for a brief moment, we were both real to each other. I started chatting with the cashier at the supermarket. Not tingdip, just small observations. What a beautiful day today, isn't it? Did you change nice something? At first, she seemed surprised, as if she wasn't used to customers actually talking to her, beyond asking for bags or discounts. But after a few weeks, she started smiling when she saw me. A genuine smile. "Hi, Mrs. Marta," she would say, and I felt something warm in my chest. She remembered my name. One afternoon, I was returning from the market when I saw a neighbor, a lady who lived a few houses down from mine. She was standing on the sidewalk, looking at a cardboard box at her feet. She seemed confused, frustrated. I approached. "Are you okay?" I asked. She looked at me, and I realized she was almost crying. "I ordered this online," she said, pointing to the box. "But I can't open it. I tried, but my hands. I don't have the strength anymore." I recognized that frustration, that feeling that your own body was betraying you, that things that were once simple were now obstacles. "I can try," I offered. She looked at me with a mixture of relief and gratitude that caught me off guard. "Would you mind?" I picked up the box. The tape was really tough. I struggled a bit, used the gate key to tear it, and finally managed to open it. Inside were some cookbooks. I took them out and handed them to her. "Thank you so much," she said, and her voice was filled with something beyond gratitude. It was filled with relief. Relief at not being alone in this. Relief at having someone who understood without needing to explain. "No problem," I said. "If you need help again, you can call me. I live over there." I pointed to my house. She smiled. A small but genuine smile. "I'll remember. My name is Kanseyaku. Martha, nice to meet you. Marta, thank you so much." As I continued walking home, I felt something strange. A light sensation in my chest. It was like purpose, as if for a brief moment I had been needed again. As if my presence had made a difference. It was a small moment, insignificant, perhaps, to anyone else. But to me, on that day, it meant something. 2 weeks later, Kanseyaku knocked on my door. She was carrying a plate covered with a cloth. "I made a cake," she said, somewhat embarrassed. "I used one of the recipes from the books. I thought I'd bring you a piece." To say thanked her in. Where Medico feeble and talked about nothing too profound. About the plants in the garden. About the weather. About how the neighborhood had changed over the years. But as we talked, I realized that the silence in my house had been broken in a way that hadn't happened in a long time. It wasn't my children visiting out of obligation or guilt. It was someone who had come of their own free will. Because they wanted to. Because, somehow, the two of us had made a connection. When she left, I warped say perhaps the one used to cups. To people. To presences. I started running into Helena in the square sometimes. We never made plans. But when we saw each other, we'd sit together. We'd talk or just be silent. It didn't matter. Just being there, side by side, was enough. And I noticed something curious happening. On the days when I took the initiative, when I broke my silence and connected, even minimally, with the world around me, the weight of the day felt different. It wasn't that the emptiness disappeared. The house remained empty. I remained old. I remained, in many ways, invisible to the wider world outside. But I was no longer passively waiting for someone to restore the importance I felt I had lost. Instead, I was creating small moments of importance, small moments of connection. No big, not dramatic, but real. And these moments, however small, began to accumulate, like tiny lights in a dark room. None of them bright enough to illuminate everything, but together enough for me to see where I was stepping. I started noticing other things as well. When I smiled at someone on the street and they smiled back, the day felt a little lighter. When I helped someone at the market reach something on a high shelf, I felt that warmth in my chest again. When I called my children without waiting for them to call first, the conversations were better, more genuine. It wasn't magic. It wasn't like my life had transformed overnight, but something was different. And I began to wonder, was the problem never really that the world had forgotten me? Was the problem that I had forgotten that I could still be a part of it, even if in different, smaller, quieter ways? I wasn't sure, but I was beginning to suspect so. It was on a Tuesday afternoon that everything became clearer. I was in line at the bank. The branch was crowded, as always. People rushing around, looking at their cell phones, sighing loudly every time the line dragged on. That nervous, impatient energy that seemed to fill every public space now. In front of me was a young woman holding a child in her arms. The baby couldn't have been more than a few months old. It was crying. Not that looked crack, but then endless. The mother rocked the child, murmuring low words, but I could see from her face that she was at her limit. Her eyes were red. Her posture was hunched. That exhaustion that goes beyond the body, that weighs on the soul. People around them stared, some with barely disguised irritation, others with that distant pity that doesn't help at all. I stood there watching for a few minutes, and then I heard myself saying, "Can I hold your bag so you can have your hands freer?" She looked at me, surprised, as if she hadn't expected anyone to speak to her, as if she had grown accustomed to merely being tolerated, but not helped. Seriously, her voice came out small, almost incredulous. Of course, she hesitated for a second, then handed me the bag. It was heavy, full of diapers, bottles, all that paraphernalia that babies require. With both hands free, she was able to reposition the baby better, adjust the blanket, and swaddle him more easily. The crying began to subside, slowly, until it stopped. The mother let out a long sigh and looked at me with teary eyes. Thank you so much." "No problem," I said, and I meant more. I know how it is. I remember being so tired that even a small gesture felt like a salvation. But I didn't say any of that. Premier juste ma l'aide. When it was her turn, I returned the bag. She thanked me again and left, but something stayed with me. Something I couldn't quite name. I went home thinking about that scene, that simple moment. And I asked myself, how many times have I been in similar situations and done nothing? How many times have I seen someone needing help and assumed it wasn't my responsibility, or that my help wouldn't be welcome, or that I had nothing to offer? And what's more, how many times have I been in that mother's place and no one offered help? I remembered when my children were little. I remember going out with them, carrying bag, a stroller, diapers, trying to control two restless boys while shopping or running errands at the bank. I remembered how exhausting it was, how invisible I felt in my exhaustion. People would pass by, look, but no one would ask, "Do you need help?" At the time, I thought that's just how it was, that everyone had to take care of their own things, that asking for help was a sign of weakness, that offering help was meddling. But now, 75 years later, I understood it differently. Offering help wasn't interference. It was recognition. It was saying, I see you. I realize you're here, that you're struggling, and you're not alone in this. And maybe that was exactly what I had been looking for all this time. Not for someone to solve my loneliness, not for my children to start calling me every day again, not for the world to start revolving around me again, but just for someone to see me, for someone to recognize that I was still here, that I still mattered. If I needed this, how many other people did too? I started paying more attention. As a marquet, he saw an elderly man trying to reach something on a shelf. He was standing on tiptoe, stretching his arm, but he couldn't reach it. I wasn't much taller myself, but I grabbed a can of peas that was in front of him and handed it to him. Thank you, he said. And then, instead of leaving, he stood there for a second, as if he wanted to say something else, but didn't know what. Sometimes I think these shelves were made for people who are 2 meters tall, I said, trying to lighten the mood. He laughed, a short but genuine laugh. That's right. Either we shrink with age or the shelves grow. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important, about changes in the market, about how things used to be different. Old people talk, as my children would say. But for us, at that moment, it was real. It was connection. When we said goodbye, he said it was good to talk. Sometimes you go the whole day without exchanging a word with anyone. I knew exactly what he meant. I began to realize that small gestures generated unexpected returns. Not always, not in a predictable way, but they did. When I smiled at someone, they often smiled back. When I offered help, people opened up. They told me things. They shared small pieces of their lives. And in those brief moments, I felt less invisible. I felt real again, but it wasn't just about me. I could see in people's faces that these small gestures also made a difference to them. The mother at the bank who had received a moment of relief. The man at the market who had a genuine conversation after spending the day alone. The cashier who now greeted me enthusiastically whenever I showed up. They weren't huge changes. They weren't life-changing transformations. But they were small cracks in the wall of invisibility that we all, in some way, carry with us. One morning, I found Helena in the square again. She had a different expression, lighter, almost happy. Something happened, she said as soon as she saw me, even before I sat down. What it was. My granddaughter called yesterday just to chat. No reason. She said Shelina smiled in her eyes. It had been years since anyone had said that to me. That they missed my voice. I sat down next to her. That's good, I said, and I felt genuine happiness for her. But I also felt something else. A silent question. Why? Why now? What had changed? As if reading my thoughts, Helena continued, You know what's funny? I called her last week. I hadn't called in months. I always waited for her to call. But last week I thought, why am I waiting? And I called. She looked at me. And yesterday she called back. Out of the blue. We were silent for a moment. Then Helena said, almost as if she were thinking aloud, Is that how it is? Is it that when we stop waiting and start doing, things respond? I had no answer, but the question stayed with me, because I had also noticed something similar. Since I started calling my children more often, they had also started calling more. Not every day, but more than before. Sometimes to ask how I was. Sometimes just a little thing. But things that mattered. My daughter had shown up unannounced on Sunday. She brought the boys. I thought I'd come visit you, she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, as if months hadn't passed since the last time. And I had noticed something in the way she looked at me. Less guilt, les obligations more. Preza wanted to be there, not just felt she should be. What had changed? I wasn't sure, but something was there. I started thinking about it on quiet nights when I was alone with my thoughts. For so long, I had lived waiting for people to realize I was alone, waiting for them to feel they should call, visit, include me, waiting for the world to remember me. And in that waiting period, I had remained still, passive, as if my life were something that happened to me, not something I had control over. But when I stopped waiting and started acting, even in small ways, something changed. Not just in other people, but in me. I felt different. Les aveux invisibles. Not because the world had magically changed, but because I had stopped hiding in my own invisibility, because, deep down, a part of me had grown accustomed to it. He had settled into solitude. He had used his age, widowhood, and silence as excuses not to participate in life anymore. It was easier this way. It was safer. Waiting for others to come to me meant I never risked being rejected. I never risked bothering them. I never risked discovering that perhaps my presence wasn't as desired as I'd like. But it also meant that I never really tried. And when I started trying, when I started stepping out of my passive waiting zone and started making small movements toward people, something happened. People responded. Not always, not all, but enough to make me realize that perhaps invisibility wasn't something the world had imposed on me. Perhaps it was something I had unknowingly chosen, not consciously, not on purpose, but chosen nonetheless. I chose to stop trying, to wait for life to go back to the way it was, instead of accepting that it had changed and that I needed to change along with it. One afternoon, I was watering the plants in the garden when Kanseku walked by on the sidewalk. She stopped and waved. "Your plants are beautiful," she said. "Thank you. They are a lot of work, but they are worth it." She stood there for a moment, as if wanting to say something more. Then she said, "You know, I was thinking, we could start walking together in the mornings. The doctor said I need to exercise more, but it's so hard to stay motivated on my own." I felt something warm spread across my chest. "I'd love to. Really, that's great." So tomorrow, 8 o'clock? Could it be? When she left, I stood in the garden, holding the hose, feeling the water trickle between the plants, and I realized I was smiling. It wasn't a smile of complete happiness. There was still loneliness. There was still silence. There were still long, empty nights. But there was also this, small moments of connection, small gestures that generated other small gestures, like waves, like echoes. And for the first time in a long time, I felt that maybe there was a pattern to it. No jeu-luc. Not just coincidence, but a real relationship between what I put into the world and what the world gave back to me. Not immediately, not obviously, but consistently enough that I could no longer ignore it. When I closed myself off, the world closed itself off to me. When I opened myself a little, éveillé fear, the world also always. Not completely, but enough, and maybe that was all I needed. Not a complete transformation, not a new life, juste enough, small moments enough to make the days bearable, to remember that I was still here, that I still mattered, that I could still make a difference, even a small one. Première went on seed and water boil. I looked around the kitchen, the same table, The same chair where I had spent so many mornings alone, holding cold coffee, sinking into silence. But now, somehow, it seemed different. Not because something had physically changed, but because I had changed. My way of being in that space, my way of being in the world. And I asked myself, what else could change if I continued? If I continued making these small gestures, if I continued opening myself up, connecting, choosing presence instead of waiting, I didn't know the answer. But for the first time in a long time, I was curious to find out. 3 months later, I was sitting in the doctor's office waiting for my routine appointment. The waiting room was full. People leafing through old magazines, restless children, the muffled sound of conversations and the humming of the air conditioner. Next to me, a younger woman was staring intently at her cell phone. She must have been about 40 years old. Tired face, tense shoulders. That posture of someone carrying too much weight. We stood there, side by side, in silence. Then she sighed. A long, heavy sigh. The kind of sigh that escapes when you can't hold it in any longer. I looked at her. Our eyes met for a second. And in that second, I saw something I recognized. Exhaustion, loneliness, that feeling of doing everything alone and having no one to share the burden with. Difficult days, I asked softly. She seemed surprised that someone had spoken to her. She hesitated. Then she nodded. Always, she said, and her voice was heavy with something beyond weariness. It was heavy with surrender. I understand, I said. And then, I don't know why. Maybe because I was a stranger, and strangers are sometimes easier to listen to, she started talking. About work, about the children, about her husband who traveled a lot, about her elderly mother who was starting to forget things and needed more attention, about how she felt pulled in 1,000 different directions and could never manage everything. And the worst part, she said, her voice breaking slightly, is that nobody asks how I am. Everyone needs me, but nobody asks if I need anything. I held her hand. I didn't say anything for a moment. Premier jeu, elle dit the right words. Sometimes just being present is enough. You're not alone in this, I finally said. I know it feels like it, but you're not. She looked at me with teary eyes. How do you cope? You seem at peace. I almost laughed, peacefully, if she only knew. If she only knew about the nights I spent sitting alone in the kitchen, the mornings staring at the unanswered phone, all that suffocating emptiness that almost swallowed me whole. I'm not always at peace, I said honestly, but I've learned something recently. I've learned that waiting for people to realize you need them doesn't work. You have to say it, you have to ask, and you have to remember that giving doesn't mean disappearing. You matter too. She remained silent, absorbing the words. Then the nurse called her name. Before standing up, she squeezed my hand. Thank you, she said. Really, everything will be all right, I said, and I believed it. When she left conversation about how strange it was to be on the other side now. No longer the person who needed support, but the person who offered support. And I realized that somehow, in the last few months, I had stepped away from my own pain long enough to perceive the pain of others. And in doing so, my own pain had become smaller. It hadn't disappeared, but it had ceased to be all I saw. Because when you're wallowing in your own loneliness, it's easy to think you're the only one suffering. It's easy to become so focused on your own invisibility that you stop seeing that everyone around you is also struggling with their own versions of it. The mother at the bank, the man at the market, Helena in the square, Kanseyaku with her box, the woman at the doctor's office. All of us, each carrying our own invisible burdens, each feeling, in some way, forgotten, unseen, not enough. And I realized that perhaps the secret wasn't waiting for someone to break your loneliness. Perhaps it was breaking someone else's loneliness, and in doing so, breaking your own as well. Not in a selfish way, not as a transaction, but because connection generates connection. Presence generates presence. When your world, even with fear, even with doubt, Benzik, not always, not perfectly, but enough. I started walking with Kanseaku every morning. Those walks became the best part of my day. Not because we did anything extraordinary. We just walked. We talked. Sometimes we were silent, but it was a shared silence, and that made all the difference. Helena joined us a few times, and then another neighbor, on a noté, until we had a small group of women who met in the mornings, walked together, and shared coffee afterward. We weren't close friends. We didn't share our deepest secrets, but we were there for each other. And that constant, predictable presence meant that neither of us ever felt completely alone. My children started calling me more often, not every day, but 2 or 3 times a week, and the conversations were different, less functional, more genuine. My daughter told me she'd noticed a change in me. "You seem lighter, Mom," she said. "I can't explain it, but you seem different." I didn't know how to explain it either, because there wasn't a specific event. There wasn't a dramatic turning point, just a series of small choices, small gestures, small movements toward life instead of toward waiting. And these small movements, accumulated over time, had changed something fundamental. Not my outward circumstances. I was still old. I was still a widow. I still lived alone. There were still silent days and long nights, but my inner attitude had changed. My way of being in the world. I had stopped seeing myself as a victim of time, of age, of abandonment. I had stopped passively waiting for my life to regain its meaning, and it had begun to create meaning, small fragments of it, in every conversation, in every gesture, in every moment of connection, however brief. And I discovered something surprising. When you stop waiting for life to give you purpose and start actively creating it, however small, life respond. Not meekly, not immediate, but consistently. When I offered my presence, I received presence in return. When I opened myself up, people opened themselves up to me. When I chose connection instead of isolation, connections appeared. Not always, not perfectly, but enough for me to perceive a pattern, a clear relationship between what I put out into the world and what I received in return. And I realized that maybe this was what I had been looking for all along. Not a magic solution. Not a return to the past. Not that my children would need me again the way they needed me when they were children. But simply this, a way of being present, a way of caring, a way of friends, even if small, even if still. One afternoon, I was at the market when I saw the cashier talking to the manager. She seemed upset. When it was my turn, I asked if everything was all right. She hesitated, then said, "My grandmother died yesterday." I felt a tightness in my chest. "I'm sorry. Thank you." She mechanically scanned my purchases, but I could see she was holding back tears. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't be talking about this at work. There's no need to apologize," I said. "Pain doesn't wait for the right time." She looked at me, and then the tears started to fall. I I haven't been able to visit her in the last few weeks. I've been so busy. And now she's gone and I'll never be able to again. Hey, I said softly. She knew you loved her. I'm sure of it. How do you know? Because love isn't just about visits. It's in everything you did before. In everything you were to her. A week, 2 weeks, can't erase a whole lifetime. She nodded, wiping away her tears. Thank you. You're always so kind to me. It makes a difference, you know? It makes a difference. Those 2 words stayed with me as I walked home. It makes a difference. Perhaps that's all it took. Perhaps we didn't need grand gestures, grand transformations, grand events. Perhaps we only needed small, consistent acts of kindness, small presences, small reminders that we are not alone. And perhaps, by offering this to others, we would end up receiving it back. Not always from the same people, not always in the way we expected, but it would come back like an echo, like waves that expand in circles when you throw a stone into the water. I arrived home and, for the first time in a long time, the house didn't seem oppressively silent. Not because there was noise, but because the silence no longer carried that weight of abandonment. It was just silence. Neutral, peaceful. I made coffee. I sat at the table. I looked out the window. The same window I had looked at so many times in the last few months, but my gaze was different now. I was no longer searching for something that was missing. You were simply looking, observing, present. My phone rang. It was my son. Hi, Mom. How are you? Everything's fine, son. And you? Well, look, I was thinking, how about we have dinner at my place on Saturday? You, us, the kids, nothing special, just being together. I felt that familiar warmth in my chest. I'd love to. Great. Then when premiere up, I held a filet tension. But it was different from before. Before, a call like that would be all I had. It would be the only moment of connection on days of emptiness. Now, it was one among many. I had my morning walk with Konseyaku. I met Helena in the square in the afternoon. I had the girl from the market who now really talked to me. I had Konseyaku who would stop by for coffee sometimes. I had small moments scattered throughout the days that made life seem full, not in the way it used to be, but full in a new way. And I realized something fundamental. I had stopped measuring my importance by how often my children called. I had stopped measuring my relevance by how much people needed me. Instead, I had begun to measure my life by the moments when I was truly present, by the moments when I made a difference, even a small one, by the moments when I chose connection, kindness, openness. And those moments, accumulated together, had changed everything, not my situation, but my experience of the situation. I was still old. I still lived alone. There was still loneliness. But loneliness was no longer all I saw. It was no longer all I felt. There was also this small moments of light, small connections, small reminders that I was still here, that I still mattered, that I could still make a difference. And perhaps that's all any of us really needed. Not greatness, not ultimate relevance, not being the center of the world. Just knowing that we matter, even if just a little, even if silently, even if in small ways, invisible to the rest of the world. I finished my coffee. I washed the cup. And while it dried, I thought of all the women like me, all the people like me, sitting in their kitchens, looking out the windows, wondering if they still mattered. And I wanted them to know what I was beginning to understand. You matter. not because someone told you so, not because someone needs you, but because you exist, because you can choose to make a difference, because you can choose to be present, because you can choose kindness. And when he's even with fear, even doubt some changes. Not the whole world, but your little piece of it. And perhaps that would be enough. I looked out the window one more time. The sun was beginning to set. The golden light bathed the trees, the houses, the empty street. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of the approaching night. I wasn't afraid of the silence that was to come, because I knew that tomorrow there would be the walk. There would be coffee with Conseil. There would be the girl from the market. There would be small moments of connection scattered throughout the day. And on Saturday, there would be dinner with my son. Ait mi famille. Not because they felt obligated, but because they wanted to. And perhaps that was the greatest transformation of all. Not that they had changed, but that I had changed. And in changing, the way we related to each other had also changed. I had stopped expecting them to save me from my loneliness. And in doing so, I had made it easier for them to simply be present, without guilt, without juste présence. I closed the curtain slowly. I turned on the kitchen light. And while I was preparing a simple dinner for myself, I realized I was humming, softly, almost imperceptibly. But he was humming. And how long has it been since I last did that? I smiled to myself, and I thought, maybe that's it. Maybe life will never be the same again. Maybe it will always be different, always changing, always demanding that we change along with it. But perhaps, if we have the courage to open up, to connect, to choose presence instead of waiting, life will respond. Not with miracles, not with dramatic transformations, but with small moments, small connections, small reminders that, despite everything, despite time, despite the invisibility that aging brings, we are still here. We still import them. We can still make a difference. And perhaps that's all we really need to know. If this story touched you in any way, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications. That way, you'll be notified whenever a new story like this is shared here. And if you feel like it, leave a comment. You can share if you've ever experienced something similar, what this story evoked in you, or even where you're watching it from. Sometimes, writing a few words is the first step in realizing that you're not alone.